Hello, everybody. This is Bookworm, and welcome to my 33rd podcast, and for those lucky enough to find it, a video. It's November 23rd, and I decided to do something new. I spent the last little more than a week taking care of a relative who had a big surgery. I was glad to do it. I'm glad to be back. I celebrated my return with a much-needed massage, during which my lovely massage therapist asked, why are conservatives called fascists when fascism is a socialist doctrine? This podcast, and in a grand experiment, this video, is my attempt to answer that question. I'll start by saying the basic premise here is that in America, there is no left versus right, which is the way it is in the rest of the world. There is only liberty versus tyranny, or you could call it individualism versus statism. To understand how wrong the left-right divide in politics is for America, you have to understand that the terminology comes not from America, but from the French Revolution, which began 6 years after the American Revolution ended. The French Revolution? What has that got to do with left and right in America? Well, first, a little primer about the French Revolution. Its slogan was Liberté, Égalité, Fraternité. Liberty, equality, fraternity. The goal, the primary goal, and they succeeded in that, was to destroy the absolute monarchy. However, there was no secondary goal of liberty or equality. It was not a revolution for individual liberty. Instead, it set up the first commune. But what does that have to do with left and right? And how did we end up with that in America? Well, left and right were geographic settings, basically, for the French Parliament. In the French Parliament, during the lead up to the revolution, the absolutists, the ones who supported the monarchy, sat on the speaker's right. Those representatives, the opposites who still sought absolutism, only of a different kind, sat to the speaker's left. As I'll develop at greater length, America has not traditionally had any cognates to this type of left-right divide, which was a struggle for absolute power within France. There is still room in all of this for a left-right analysis, although the American political system fits into it very awkwardly. I have my favorite chart, a copy of which will be on my blog. All forms of government exist along a single continuum and can be defined either by state power or individual liberty. It is a continuum that can be understood going from the left to the right. So we do have that left-right thing, although I still feel it's an awkward analogy ultimately when applied to America. The left is total state power, no individual freedom, and the right is very little state power and lots of individual freedom. So you can see that here on my chart, and my chart is loading very slowly. I think my computer's tired. The far left is totalitarianism, and we are very familiar with totalitarianism. It goes by different individuals, monarchs such as Caligula, Henry VIII, Louis XIV, dictators such as Hitler, Mao, Stalin, Kim Jong-un, religious leaders such as Iran's mullahs. There are also regime types, and they are all familiar names that we've seen in our lifetime: communism, fascism, socialism, theocracy, military juntas, absolute monarchies. Socialism, we've seen in its soft form across Europe, which I'll discuss more. To all this, we have anarchy on the very far right. That's when you have no state power and no individual liberty. But there's only one form of government that actually lives on the right side of that dividing line. But it's not really, if you do this left-right continuum, you could say that conservatives live on the right, but that's not how the left uses it. They use it in the way of the French Revolution, where they envision everybody taking absolute power of one kind or another. What we have in America on that right side of is the constitutional experiment. It's built on Britain's Magna Carta from the 13th century, and Britain's 1689 Bill of Rights, which is not the same as the American Bill of Rights. William of Orange and Queen Mary agreed to limitations on their power when they took the throne in 1689 after Britain's Glorious Revolution. Significantly, the Bill of Rights did not state that rights inhere in the individuals, and the Bill of Rights left Parliament without any limitations, which allowed it to impose its will on the colonies despite their demands for representation, etc. When our founders came around to creating our Constitution, they specifically created a limited, small central government, and they created a Bill of Rights that states natural rights inherent in the individual. In this way, Obama got it wrong when he called it a negative charter, by which he meant it was things that government lacked. It's not so much that government lacks, it's that we, the people, have, and government doesn't get to go there. So let's dig down into the three most common forms of government around the world since World War I. The first is socialism, and that's fallen into different types of socialism. We have communism, which has no private ownership. The state nationalizes everything. We saw that in the Soviet Union. It was in China before its market experiment, Gesundheit to my friend who's here while I podcast, and North Korea. You can also see it in Cuba. The next type of government is fascism or oligarchies, and Mussolini defined fascism as all within the state, nothing outside the state, nothing against the state. While fascism sometimes nationalizes major industries and transportation sectors, it does allow private ownership provided that the government controls all ultimate decision making. The last thing is what I call European of socialism is European post-World War II socialism, or in Russia, you have the oligarchs. And those forms of government are pretty much like fascism, except without the genocide and wars for world domination. However, those of us who have been watching the Muslim incursions into Europe worry that genocidal anti-Semitism and a push for world domination are back in play. The European post-war socialism worked so well, so long. Socialism usually doesn't, because America funded it. This has been a bee in my bonnet for a long time. I grew up in a household with European parents. We had a lot of visitors coming through from Europe, and they always boasted about their wonderful cradle-to-grave care and tutted about how pathetic it was that my parents didn't have that. What none of them realized was that the only reason Europeans had this cradle-to-grave care was because America absorbed Europe's defense costs. So Europe didn't have socialism, Europe had Americanism. The other type of government one sees nowadays is monarchies and theocracies. Those are most common in the Middle East. Saudi Arabia is an example of a monarchy that retains its throne because of a pact with theocrats, and Iran is a former monarchy that became a theocracy. And then you have liberal democracies and parliamentary systems. I spoke earlier about post-World War II socialism in Europe, and I can also say the same for Israel. These are soft fascism. They have a fair amount of freedom, a lot of government control. They're not currently world domination, although, as I said, I worry about Europe's rising tide of Muslims and their genocidal anti-Semitism. You'll notice that I missed something from this list. I'll come to it in a minute. What I missed is the American political system as the founders envisioned it. They imagined a limited federal government composed of three separate parts, each with their own sphere of power and influence, and each with some power to set limitations on the other branches of government. This does not mean that they can control the other branch of government, but they can act as a brake. We're all expected jealously to guard their power. The first branch is the executive branch, and that is not a pure democratic office. The executive is elected through the Electoral College, which is a unique system that forces a presidential candidate to campaign in every state. Hillary learned to her cost not to do that. Without this kind of system, it would mean that only the large population centers would elect every president. If the National Vote Compact, or whatever it's called, to do away with the Electoral College by an unconstitutional means comes into power, it means that all future presidents will be elected by the Los Angeles basin, Chicago, New York, and Washington, D.C. And that will be it. There will never again be a conservative president, although there may be a totalitarian president. The next branch is the two-part legislative branch. That has the Senate, which, as envisioned, was also not meant to be popularly elected. In each case, it was supposed to be that the state's governors appointed the two senators, so that the senators would be very responsive to the states and would not be swayed by popular passions within the states. That was changed in 1912 by the 17th Amendment. We also have the House, which is in fact subject to the popular vote. Representatives rotate through every 2 years. They have the power of the purse in addition to legislative powers, and they have the power to initiate impeachment. These two powers come about because representatives have to go back to their people every 2 years and ask to be elected again. The current impeachment proceedings are profoundly anti-democratic by not having members of the House stand up and say what they believe, and by running roughshod over due process, which denies the voters a chance to see what's really going on and see where their representatives stand. The next thing we have is the judicial branch. And this branch was intended to be an impartial branch that is totally non-democratic, because its members are selected by the president and approved by the House. Approved by the Senate. The federal judiciary of late has arrogated to itself both executive and legislative powers. Legislatively, it's found a couple of new things in the Constitution that never existed before. By using an umbrella of penumbras and emanations and stuff, it found the right to abortion, and by reading some steamy romance novels, it found the right to gay marriage. That was legislative stuff. At the executive level, since Trump became president, every podunk federal court judge in a liberal district has taken upon himself or herself the right to determine executive policy and to read Trump's mind and conclude that facially appropriate executive orders don't pass muster because Trump is a meanie and needs to be ignored. Finally, our founders did the Bill of Rights. I've mentioned it before. It is a charter of rights that are not granted by government, but that are inherent in each individual. What are the things that flow from a limited government and a Bill of Rights? Well, let me tell you. One of the wonders of our Bill of Rights is the way it leaves room for free market capitalism, which has led to wealth and innovation unheard of in all other times and places. And before I get to the picture, you can already see the little link below because I'm still learning the system. Just think about the fact that China falsely propped up its market, and it was all along a fake puffed up thing, and once Trump started putting pressure on it, it's been deflating quickly and almost dangerously. Meanwhile, in America, under Trump's lower regulations and lower taxes policy, we've been having record highs in the stock market. And for those of you who are listening to this, I got an article from thebalance.com, which is about the record highs set in 2018. Yeah, I'm lazy. I didn't look for one about the record highs this year. Just the first two paragraphs, the Dow hit 3 1,000-point milestones in 2018. It hit 2 of them in the first few weeks in January. It closed above 25,000 on January 4th, and it breached 26,000 on January 17. The index set 15 closing records in 2018. A lot of highs. What's also interesting about Trump's market is it had some lows. The records set in the fall were the first ones since the Dow reached 26,616.71 on January 26, 2018. After hitting that peak, the Dow went into free fall, dropping 4% the next week. On February 8th, it entered a market correction when it fell 1,032.89 points to 23,860.46 points. The article goes on about the corrections. So it's huge highs, low corrections, more huge highs, low corrections. That's because Trump has faith in the marketplace and in the wisdom of the crowds. And that is one of the blessings of liberty and freedom. Our current crop of Democrat candidates is very hostile to the free market. The most notable examples, of course, are Bernie, the arch communist, who has no excuse for it because he's not a millennial who knows nothing. He's lived long enough to see the horrors of the Soviet Union, of Pol Pot, of China, of Cuba, of North Korea, that he is still a true believer, speaks either to his abysmal stupidity or his true power-hungry evil lust for total control over the American people. But we're also seeing that kind of hostility to the free market from others. There's Kamala Harris, who recently announced that she's going to go after the drug industry. She proposed, and I don't have audio of it here because it went on too long for my taste in her boring, drab voice, but she was saying that she was going to make drug companies charge prices that are averaged out over the globe, ignoring the fact that a lot of countries, A, have government subsidies, and B, don't have to force drug companies to sell them at costs that don't reflect all the research and development. But then she goes into the fact that, yes, some drug companies do get federal subsidies, which I don't approve of, but ignoring the fact that a lot of the drug company money for the research and development and marketing and everything comes from shareholders. This is what Kamala had to say.
The other thing is this. If people don't want to cooperate with that, I'm also going to do the next thing, which is this. A lot of drugs, prescription medication, was born out of federal funding for the research and development of that drug. Your taxpayer dollars. So for any drug where they failed to play by our rules, and if that drug came about because of federal funding for what's called R&D, research and development, I will snatch their patent so that we will take over. And yes, we can do that. Yes, we can do that. Yes, we can do that. It's the question is, do you have the will to do it? I have the will to do it.
That's not even fascism. That's full-bore communism. We also have in America social mobility of a type that does not exist elsewhere. And I just put together a photo collage of names that popped into my head of people who at any other time in any other place would not have reached the heights they've achieved here. So for those of you who are listening, it really is a random collection of people. Harry Truman, Mark Twain, yes, Hillary Clinton, who ascended very high thanks to the blessings of America, Clarence Thomas, Jeff Bezos, Kanye West, Thomas Sowell, Kim Kardashian, Nikki Haley, Thomas Edison, John D. Rockefeller, Abraham Lincoln, John Cena, Simone Biles, anyway, that brilliant gymnast, Taylor Swift. All of these people had a way to make it up through entertainment, through politics, through inventions, through academics, through the marketplace. We have incredible social mobility, and we have a constant swirl. The fact that your grandparents were rich doesn't mean you'll be rich, and the fact that your grandparents were poor does not mean you'll be poor. And that is one of the great blessings. Another of the blessings of our liberty is the right to arm oneself against all threats, both foreign and domestic. The photo that illustrates this slide is the famous photo of Nazis rounding up Jews in the Warsaw Ghetto. And you see women and children, little children, 8 years old, with their hands up. And you know that all of them are going to be shipped to the death camps. I'm willing to bet that every single person in this photo ended up dead within a few months or years. Before embarking upon this attack against European Jewry, Nazis seized guns. They seized guns first in Germany and then in every place they invaded. It's also worth noting that around the world, America is one of the only places with fairly unlimited rights for civilians to have arms. And yes, we do have a lot of gun deaths every year, although not as many as there are car accidents, but they are sadly concentrated almost entirely in a few Democrat-run inner cities, and they are dwarfed by the number of times people have used guns defensively to save their own lives or the lives of others. It's also worth noting that a failed state just south of our border, that would be Mexico, which has a staggering homicide rate, has some of the strictest gun laws in the world. If there's one thing Democrats aren't shy about, it's their absolute determination to seize guns. And it's so funny, they're still trying to do it under Donald Trump, even though they keep calling Donald Trump Hitler. It shows how irrational their desire to seize guns is, but they're very open. Before he dropped out, Beto O'Rourke got one of his biggest applause lines by insisting that he was going to take guns away.
Time, hell yes, we're going to take your AR-15, your AK-47. We're not going to allow it to be used against our fellow Americans anymore. Thank
you. Listen to the passion in his voice and the enthusiasm of that audience. That's scary stuff, because we know that guns can be the difference between life and death, and that barring a few high-profile cases by crazed stoners who come from fatherless Democrat homes, the reality is that the vast numbers of Americans safely own and use guns for self-preservation, sport, and as a defense against government overreach. Another of our extraordinary rights, of course, is the right to free speech. That's a right that's already vanishing in England, which, as I keep saying, doesn't have a written constitution constraining Parliament. I just read today about a British woman who was blocked from leaving the country because she had offended the transgender activists. Couldn't find that article, didn't look very far, but did find one from last year in the Daily Mail. Mother, 38, is arrested in front of her children and locked in a cell for 7 hours after calling a transgender woman a man on Twitter. Police officers detained Kate Scotthow, 38, at her home in Hitchin, Hertfordshire. So there was a raid on her home. More than 2 months after her arrest, and she has neither her mobile phone nor her laptop returned. The complaints were made by activist Stephanie Hayden, led to arrest of Mrs. Scotthow. Now, Stephanie Hayden, of course, is Stephen Hayden, or whatever his birth name is. So what you have in England is a woman who looks at a man in a dress, who's taken hormones, who's maybe cut off his bits and pieces, who has fake breasts, and says, you can do whatever you want to your body, you're still a man. But in England, that's hate speech. And if you're thinking it can't happen here, boy, are you wrong. Just go to any. In New York, starting in 2015, the city announced that it would fine businesses $250,000 for misgendering a transsexual. So far as I know, either nobody's misgendered or the city hasn't enforced that law, so it hasn't been tested, but it is a municipal law in New York. California has gone one step further. It's not just New York City or San Francisco or LA, it's the whole state of California. California has a lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender long-term care facility residents' Bill of Rights. And at California Health and Safety Code section 1439.51, subdivision A5, you read this. Except as provided in subdivision B, which is not relevant here, it shall be unlawful for a long-term care facility or facility staff to take any of the following actions wholly or partially on the basis of a person's actual or perceived sexual orientation, gender identity, gender expression, or human immunodeficiency virus, HIV status. 5, willfully and repeatedly fail to use a resident's preferred name or pronouns after being clearly informed of the preferred name or pronouns. Now, I happen to know, because I have had a lot to do with people in long-term care facility residences, that many of the staff working there are from the Philippines, which is a traditional culture, or are African Americans, or even from places like Haiti, which are traditional cultures. And with very few exceptions, these people have been well-intentioned and kind and loving and helpful. But let me tell you, it is not a priority of theirs to properly gender someone. But it's the law in California, and if they violate it, their business is in trouble. So back to my chart. I'm just putting it up on the screen again so that you can see, and for those of you who didn't see it but can use your imagination, on the left, more state power, less individual liberty, totalitarian leaders, communism, fascism, socialism, theocracy, military junta, absolute monarchy. And on the right, you really only have the American way of doing things, or just total anarchy, which usually folds back into totalitarianism when a strong person takes over. So keeping that divide in mind, I'm going back to that left-right thing. Now remember, everywhere in the world, left and right means competing visions of total power. America, however, has two entirely different political tensions. It is not competing visions of total power. Like the rest of the world, it has its status, aka leftist, Democrats, progressive, the misnomer of liberals. And those are people who call themselves liberals, but they're really all about government control over you, the individual, over your money, over your life choices. They're hostile to wealth. They're hostile to liberty. I got a few quotes. Barack Obama, whose net worth is $40 million, once said, "We're not trying to push financial reform because we begrudge success that's fairly earned. I do think at a certain point you've made enough money, but you know, part of the American way is you can just keep on making it if you're providing a good product." So again, Barack, $40 million, Obama, says that the government gets to decide what's fair, and the government gets to decide, not the marketplace, if you're providing a good product. Then there's Elizabeth Warren, net worth $18 million, who said, very snippily, "You built a factory out there, good for you, but I want to be clear. You moved your goods to market on the roads that the rest of us paid for. You hired workers that the rest of us paid to educate. You were safe in your factory because of police forces and fire forces that the rest of us paid for." Now, first of all, we know that there's no rest of us. As Mitt Romney went down in flames on, I think 47 or 49% of Americans pay no federal taxes. So they're not being the rest of us, and they probably don't pay a lot of state taxes either. We also know that the top 1% and 2% and 10% account for something like 60 to 70% of all taxes paid. So if you moved your goods to market on roads, you probably paid for them. And when you hired workers, you probably paid to educate them. But in any event, a free market has certain common goods that people willingly contribute to, but it's up to individual initiative and innovation to benefit for that. By the way, Elizabeth Warren, net worth $18 million, got started on the road to wealth by writing a book stating the obvious, which is that real estate prices go up when there are good public schools. Duh. She got more wealth by going to Harvard by lying about her ancestry. And she represented bad companies by the leftist rubric. She flipped houses in the 2008 housing debacle. And she taught a single class and got several $100,000 a year. But she doesn't want you to get wealthy. And lastly, there's Kamala Harris, dumb, boring Kamala Harris. I will snatch their patents so that we will take over, net worth $4 million, clearly hoping to be worth a lot more when she leaves the White House. And then you have on the other side, you don't have people who want to use the government to enrich themselves. You don't have that left right tension that you find in other places. Unlike any other country in the world, the flip side to the American left is those who seek individual liberty. I call them conservatives and sometimes Republicans, because there are Republicans who look to government power to enrich themselves and to give them simple power. More quotations. Gerald Ford, a government big enough to give you everything you want is a government big enough to take from you everything you have. And the great Ronald Reagan, no government ever voluntarily reduces itself in size. Government programs, once launched, never disappear. Actually, a government bureau is the nearest thing to eternal life we'll ever see on this earth. And now we get to the starting point of this whole video, which is if American conservatives, well, the premise is American conservatives are the sole political movement in the world dedicated to individual liberty, as opposed to just a lust for power. Why then are American conservatives called right-wing or fascist, terms that are tied to totalitarian control, while American leftists are called liberal, implying a dedication to individual liberty, which is antithetical to leftism? Well, for that you need a little. It all starts with Stalin and Hitler. They both presided over socialist governments. Hitler was a fascist socialist government which had private ownership but government control, and Stalin was a communist socialist government which was no private ownership of the means of production. The two countries and their leaders hated each other, not as opposing political systems, but as rival socialist systems. In August 1939, Nazi Germany and Soviet Russia entered into the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. They entered into it about a week before Hitler invaded Poland and started World War II. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact was a neutrality pact, so Stalin kept to his promise to stay out of the war and be neutral. At the home front in America, this meant that American communists who were in academia and Hollywood, among other places, were very lukewarm in their support of the war. This all ended abruptly on June 22, 1941, when Hitler initiated Operation Barbarossa by invading the Soviet Union. Suddenly, in the theater of war, Russia and America became allies. In America also, the American communists instantly became staunch and fervent anti-Nazis. All of this created a problem for the American communists when the war ended. Fascist socialism stood exposed as one of the most evil ideologies of all time. Despite the lies of the New York Times, people were aware that there were problems in Stalin's Soviet Union. How in the world were the American communists to advance communism without having socialist fascism drag them down? The answer was to create a false syllogism. Part 1, communists and fascists were enemies, right? They fought World War II against each other. The communists were victorious. The evil fascists went down in flame. World War II proved that fascists were completely evil. The death camps spoke for themselves, let alone the fact that Hitler had put the whole world ablaze. Fascists, evil. In America, communists and Republicans are enemies. Well, the syllogism ends by saying Republicans, by standing against communists, are therefore akin to fascists, and like fascists, they are therefore evil. And that is a syllogism that has taken place in the American public consciousness since World War II. And that is why American conservatives, who are all in favor of individual liberty, are called right-wing fascists. That's why they're accused of all sorts of evilness. That's why Trump is called Hitler. And that's why nasty white supremacist groups, which also seek government power to engage in their nefarious schemes, are anchored to the right when they, the right to the conservative movement when they should not be. So, is there a moral to this whole narrative? Yes, there is. Conservatives are not fascists. They are, instead, the world's only true fighters for individual liberty. Next time someone accuses you of being some sort of right-wing, power-hungry, racist, fascist nut, you know the answer to that. And I bet you can put it much more, with much greater brevity than anything I did. And if you're hearing a gentle peep sing, that is my dog seeking my attention. So, thank you so much for listening, and if you watched, for watching. Let me know what you think by emailing me at bookworm@gmail.com. That's the best way to get any message to me is via email. Also, please visit my blog, bookwormroom.com, where you'll find lots of original content from both me and my co-blogger, Wolf Howley.